one small problem with the conservative Presbyterian denominations, and it's that they're not exactly Presbyterian. Hey guys, welcome back to Kingdom Craft, where I built this big Presbyterian church in Minecraft while I talk about Christianity. So today I'm talking about this one small detail about the Presbyterian church that everyone forgets, but it actually makes a huge difference. And if a denomination does not have this, it's hard to actually call them Presbyterian. And it is one word: synods. So you have to understand how Presbyterians run our church government, because the name Presbyterian actually refers to how we run the church government. A Presbyterian church government has councils running everything on the local level, on the regional level, on the national level, and on the congregational level. So traditionally, according to the Church of Scotland and the PCUSA, which is the mainline Presbyterian church that I'm part of, there are basically 4 levels of councils. There is the local congregation, which is ruled by a council called the session. Then there is the local region, which is all the congregations in a specific area, whether it be San Diego, New York City, Los Angeles, Pittsburgh. They're all governed by the regional presbytery, and that's a council made up of representatives from each congregation. And then there's a broader region, which is called a synod, and the synod is made up of also representatives from each presbytery, and then the General Assembly is all the churches in the nation, which are also made up of representatives from each presbytery. Now, the presbytery does a lot of stuff. The presbytery is very important. The presbytery is in charge of who actually gets ordained, who actually gets to be a pastor. It's the presbytery that sends representatives to the General Assembly, which is the national governing body of the church. So obviously the presbytery is important. Obviously the General Assembly is very important because that's the highest level. The General Assembly makes decisions that affect the whole denomination. And obviously the local congregation is very important because that's where lay people actually interact with the church. So everyone forgets about the synod. People often think of the synod as this meaningless middleman between the presbytery and the General Assembly, and it's only necessary due to the size of the church. And what's funny is that all the offshoot Presbyterian denominations, all the conservative offshoots that split from the PCUSA due to the PCUSA going too liberal, whether we're talking about the PCA or the EPC or the OPC or ECO, they all lack synods. None of them have synods. They all have local congregations. They all have presbyteries. They all have general assemblies. None of them have synods. For a while, I thought, it's probably just because they're not big enough to have synods. They're small enough that they only really need 3 levels of authority. But recently I realized a lot of the problems that they have might stem from them not having synods, but I don't think a lot of their problems are really fixable without them rejoining the main line, so I think it might be the other way around. I think they might not have synods, or they might not see the need of synods, because they are not established institutional churches. So I understand why the people who wanted to split off and form ECO and EPC and PCA did so, because it is true that the PCUSA is drifting from historic Presbyterian theology. It is true that there is theological liberalism in the PCUSA, which means that it's abandoning Presbyterian doctrines. However, the response to that by splitting off means you're abandoning the historic Presbyterian institutions. To have the true Presbyterian church, you need both the doctrine and the institutions. So the PCA and the EPC and the OPC, these offshoots, are trying to preserve Presbyterian doctrine, but in doing so they are sacrificing Presbyterian institutions. So that way almost nobody becomes holistically Presbyterian except the few PCUSA churches and members like myself and my church that still actually do hold to Presbyterian doctrine. I'm one of those weird PCUSA members who actually believes Presbyterian things and not just, social justice and DEI. So it really helps nobody. It doesn't help the conservatives or the liberals. Actually, I think it does help the liberals when the conservatives split off, because then the liberals are free to do whatever they want. No one's there to stop them. But I do think that to be holistically Presbyterian, you need Presbyterian doctrine and institutions. So I'm not saying the institutions matter more than doctrine, but you need Presbyterian institutions. So why do the synods matter? Well, The PCA and the EPC and the OPC and ECO, these offshoots, they're not exactly institutional churches. Institutional churches are reminiscent of those European state churches, where the church owned lots of universities and summer camps, other properties, and the church was like a community center. The church actually governed a lot of the affairs of the culture because the church was a powerful institution. The mainline churches in America, which is the PCUSA for Presbyterians, the same way it's like the Episcopal Church for Anglicans and the United Methodist Church for Methodists, the mainline churches in America filled the same function that the European state churches did, because mainline churches in America were very important centers of culture. Evangelical offshoots like the PCA just don't have that role. The PCA is not an institution. It's a denomination, sure, but it's not an institutional denomination. It's more like a voluntary association of individual Presbyterian congregations, especially because in all these offshoots like the PCA, individual congregations own their own property, whereas in the PCUSA, the denomination owns the property. I think what the PCUSA does is more biblical, because in Acts, all the believers owned everything in common. It wasn't like everyone was super individualistic like things are in the PCA. And the criticism of denominations owning property is, oh, well then, that makes it harder to split off with our building. It's like, yeah, that's the whole point. You shouldn't split off. It's like the PCA is like, oh, we don't like that because that made it harder for us to split off. Good. It should be hard to split off because you shouldn't split from the church. I know this is America, but we shouldn't fall into the Catholic meme about Protestants where we all have 40 billion denominations because we split whenever we slightly disagree on something. But that still doesn't get to the question of synods. I'm getting there. My point is that the mainline Presbyterian Church, the PCUSA, is institutional. We founded Princeton. We own lots of colleges and universities all across the country. We own lots of summer camps everywhere. We own lots of property. We own lots of institutions because we are an institutional church. Now, traditionally, the governing body that would manage these institutions were synods. That's the purpose of synods that everyone forgets about. Because synods don't, regulate who becomes a pastor, because synods don't send representatives to General Assembly, everyone sort of forgot what their purpose was. So I think the reason the PCA and the EPC and the ECO don't have synods is because they don't have institutions, and institutions are kind of the whole reason we need synods. But globally and just historically, the Presbyterian Church always had synods because the Presbyterian Church was always a magisterial, institutional denomination. What do I mean by magisterial and institutional? Well, Presbyterianism, as everyone knows, comes from Scotland. And the Scottish Covenanters, who were the architects of Presbyterian government, didn't just want a voluntary association of individual congregations. No, they wanted a national church that would make sure the nation would be in covenant with God. Matthew Everhart, even though he is in the PCA, makes a lot of good videos about what the Scottish Covenanters wanted. I might disagree with Matthew Everhart on the legitimacy and the licitness of the PCA, but I don't disagree with him on the baseness and the vision of the Scottish Covenanters. They wanted a national, institutional, established church where the church would run a lot of the institutions of the culture. And that is why the Church of Scotland did, and to this day has, synods, which are very important for managing those regional institutions like universities and stuff. And in the PCUSA, the synods still do manage a lot of these regional universities. I think the PCA owns one college. It's like Covenant College in, somewhere in the South. I think it's like in Tennessee, and nobody knows it exists unless you're like already in the PCA, unless you're already in that circle. But as the book of Kings, of First Kings and Second Chronicles shows us, the church is to impress the outside world with our institutions. It's not enough to just have Bible colleges here and there that only evangelical Christians know about and nobody else respects. Christian institutions ought to be respected by the outside world. People are like, oh, why do you crave the approval of man? No, we don't crave the approval of man. But, 2 Peter, or I think it's 1 Peter, says we are to impress unbelievers with the good works that we do as the church. And traditionally, the church has impressed unbelievers by starting institutions that bless the world in various ways. And that's why it's important for the church to have institutions. And traditionally, the Presbyterian Church has managed those institutions by having synods. That's why I think synods are actually really important. and we should not neglect the importance of synods. So I guess the lack of synods in the PCA and the EPC and the OPC might be more of a symptom of the problem rather than the cause. And I would say the problem is, non-institutionality. They are not institutional denominations. They might be denominations, but they're not institutional. That's why it's hard for me to call the PCA a Presbyterian church. I would say it's more like a voluntary association of individual Presbyterian congregations. But I'm not sure if I can really call it a Presbyterian church, because the Presbyterian church has always had this four-tiered structure where regional synods actually manage the institutions and run the institutions. And that's the purpose of a regional synod, which is run by representatives from all the presbyteries. It's not just Scotland and the PCUSA that have these synods. Like global Presbyterian churches, like all the Presbyterian churches in Africa. And by the way, Presbyterianism is booming in Africa. People like maybe Catholics or Orthodox on the internet are going to be like, yo, Protestantism is dying, man. It's like in America, things don't look good for Protestantism. But there's only 2 million Presbyterians in America. There's 20 million Presbyterians in Africa. And basically every African Presbyterian church, whether it's the Presbyterian Church of Nigeria or the Church of Central Africa Presbyterian, I've done a lot of research on Presbyterianism in Africa, they all have synods. Even if they're small churches, which many of them are not, many of them are huge, but even if they are small churches, they will still divide into presbyteries and synods, because in Africa, the churches manage a lot of the institutions. The churches manage a lot of hospitals and, schools for rural children, boys and girls, by the way. The churches in Africa bless the world, and the churches are sometimes some of the biggest healthcare providers in the region, because healthcare is a lot less accessible in places like rural Africa than in America. So those are many reasons why it's very important for the church to have synods, and it's because it's important for the church to have institutions, and the church needs to manage those institutions somehow. There are some PCA Presbyterians who have addressed this question. I think Zachary Garris, who's like a prominent PCA defender on Twitter, says that institutions allowed for the encroachment of liberalism. But there's a general theme where the more institutionally established something is, the more it's inevitably going to drift towards liberalism, because liberals always target and hijack the institutions. I don't think that's an excuse to not be institutional. Of course, being more prominent in the culture is going to put you more on the radar of the liberals who want to hijack what you build. That's not an excuse to retreat, and I think that's the retreatist mindset of many in the American conservatism, not just in the PCA. This mindset that, all these colleges, universities, they've been hijacked by liberals, so let's just become anti-college. Don't send your kids to college. Well, no. The reason colleges and universities have gone liberal is not because those things are bad. It's because those things are powerful and influential. And Marxists always know to hijack the centers of power. And conservatives have not been very smart about responding. They've just reacted by retreating from the centers of power, which has basically solidified the progressive takeover of all of society. So, this is a pretty short video. I just wanted to say that synods are actually something that should not be neglected. Synods are very important for the church to be an institutional body that blesses the world and brings God's kingdom to earth in the already not yet sense. So would it help the PCA to get synods? Some people have proposed that. Maybe. Maybe it might be just sort of like a symbolic improvement, a symbolic victory. I think the underlying issue is that they're not institutional. That's the underlying issue. So if they're going to address the problem, that's what they should address first, perhaps. And then maybe if they somehow succeed in that, which I really don't think they will, if they somehow succeed in that, if by some miracle the PCA starts the next Princeton or whatever, yes, then they should definitely think about getting synods. But I don't think that's going to happen, because denominations formed out of voluntary schism, not forced schism like the Reformation, but voluntary schism, basically never become institutional. So that's why I think the best hope for the PCA and the EPC and the OPC and ECO is to rejoin the PCUSA. Thank you for watching. God bless.
Okay, guys. Got some Christian knowledge in there. Schism. No, go in.
Let me end the video now.
Can you pause the game?
The